Pacific Salmon Treaty is and how that culminates in the needs for a regulations database. I want to talk a little bit about what our plan for a database structure is, as well as a plan for populating the database. There's been kind of a number of challenges we've identified with this project, so I also kind of want to highlight those in my project. And then, like I said, at the end, I hope to leave some time for questions. So I might start out about what is the Pacific Salmon Treaty, there's a whole bunch of different management structures along the West Coast. Speaking from the perspective of someone who works for Washington, we have a structure for our inside waters, such as the Columbia River, the coastal rivers, and then for Puget Sound, we call that the North of Falcon process. We have a wider domestic management process in the coastal areas that many of you are familiar with in the Pacific Fishery Management Council. However, for our international management obligations, those are defined by the Pacific Salmon Treaty. And the treaty itself is an agreement between the U.S. and Canada to cooperate on salmon management. It was implemented in 1985, and it was most recently reaffirmed in 2019. The overall Pacific Salmon Treaty, it's governed by a group called the Pacific Salmon Commission, and it's comprised of representatives of agencies along the West Coast, including NOAA, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Services, DFO, which is the Canadian federal government, Alaska Department of Fish and Game, WDFW, ODFW, Idaho Department of Fish and Game, the tribes, First Nations, and then there's dedicated secretariat staff and also representatives from PSMFC. So, as a part of our most recent Pacific Salmon Treaty negotiations, once again, those concluding in 2019, there's a number of chapters that are in that treaty that define international management of different species. Particularly of interest for what we're talking about today, the regulations database, is Chinook management, which is in Chapter 3. In that chapter, they've outlined provisions and a need to account for differential impacts on marked and unmarked Chinook stocks in the analyses that they do. And recognizing that we have kind of a wide group of folks here, I will explain kind of what that means, marked and unmarked stocks, in just a second. But essentially the language is right here, and if folks are interested, there's a copy of the Pacific Salmon Treaty that can be found at the link below. So in Washington and in salmon hatcheries kind of around the West Coast, some salmon have what's called an adipose fin. You can see over here on the image to the right. That fin can be removed, and that represents that can represent a hatchery fish. And so we also, that's synonymous with, as in previous slides, a marked fish. And we do have fisheries along the West Coast that are called marked selective fisheries that can only harvest those marked fish, only harvest the hatchery fish. And they're designed to reduce impacts on our wild stocks, which would have that adipose fin intact. So the question raised by the Pacific Salmon Treaty is how we would potentially account for those MSFs. Currently, when we're conducting our analyses for the Pacific Salmon Commission, we're evaluating fishery impacts on adipose clipped and coated wire tagged Chinook. And once again, as mentioning, in mark selective fisheries, we might expect those adipose clipped fin fish to have a different impact to the wild fish. So as a part of addressing this kind of key question from the Pacific Salmon Treaty, we need to be able to identify when a coated wire tag is recovered in a mark selective fishery versus a non-selective fishery, i.e. that they can retain all stocks of Chinook encountered. But no such database exists. So there was an ask from the PSC to develop such a database to assist in our Chinook analyses and evaluations. We're still exploring kind of how the Chinook analysis will link to a regulations database, but preliminarily we're having kind of two potential thoughts, which is using kind of coated wire tag recoveries that are in ARMIS to verify a field that's currently called the selective fishing field in ARMIS to identify whether a fish was and a coated wire tag was recovered in a selective fishery or a non-selective fishery. A second potential approach is that we could use external estimates of catches and releases in our analyses rather than the coded wire tags themselves. But if we were going to do that, then we would have to identify when we would need to make modifications to those external estimates for a mark selective fishery. So in either situation, there becomes a need to link up a regulations database with catch. And this is the scope of this is beyond just kind of the what's being asked in the Pacific Salmon Treaty. We think that there's a lot of other potential uses for a regulations database as well. For example, in a lot of our coho modeling exercises that we do, we could validate kind of fishery information and regulation information. We could, in all of our modeling exercises, we could validate things like size limits, which are an important key input. And then we could also, just speaking for WDFW's purposes, we could automate regulation information for our reports. And there's likely many, many other uses kind of across the range of agencies along the West Coast. So I did have one example of something that we used recently here. We've been trying to, at DFW, we've been trying to start to get things in a format that can enter this database. And we have that currently set up for some of our marine areas. So Marine Area 7, you can see right here, this is an area in northern Puget Sound, and trying to look at regulations over time. You can see the blue regulations are mark selective, the pink ones are non-selective, the light gray are non-retention, and then the dark gray being closed. So having a regulations database would be a very powerful tool to set up looks at data like this and understand how fisheries are changing over time. And I think that there's a lot of extra uses. As far as the structure of the database goes, we're looking at something that's a little bit complex here. You can see kind of the intended structure over here on the right side. I know that some of that might be hard to read, but the key information that we're looking to include is related to species, as in the species name and ID, looking at bag limits for the different types of species and regulation types, looking at minimum and maximum sizes. We're looking at regulation information, as in when the regulations start and when it ends, what gear types are required in that regulation. Catch areas, this is one that we'll kind of circle back to in just a moment, because we're still thinking about the best way to implement those catch areas. But ideally, we're going to be looking for something that has a catch area code, a description, possibly some geospatial data associated with it in terms of a geographic boundary. And one piece that we're looking at doing is linking up kind of whatever catch areas that we put in the database to ARMIS location codes. Once again, there'll be a little bit more about that in a few slides. And then, of course, management year is an important part of the structure. One thing that's been particularly challenging and has required kind of a lot of discussions back and forth is regulations can vary pretty greatly across agencies. And because we are intending for this to be a multi-agency database, there's different fields, I think, that are required by specific agencies, and getting kind of all the regulation information to match up into one system across a variety of agencies is kind of one of the challenges that we faced. It's currently built in a PostgreSQL, but we're working kind of with PSMFC on what might be the best format going forward for such a database. One thing that we've identified as would be really key to the success of this database is being able to integrate it with R to automatically produce reports and analyses for the Pacific Salmon Commission, and also to be able to combine with existing systems of analysis that we've got in place. In addition to being able to access the information through R, we also envision a more user-friendly front end, for example, to allow data specialists to come in and add regulations without having a background in databases or coding. And also that front end could be used to pull information from the database, once again, for people who might not have that experience or background in coding or databases. One kind of key part about creating such a database is how we might populate it. And this is kind of at the stage where we're at now. We have a lot of the initial structure in place, and now we're starting to think about how we might go about population of such a database. Obviously, population of a database like this is a really, really huge task. There's I mean, I know from WDFW's perspective, when we look at a pamphlet of sport regulations, it's about that thick, and there's a lot of different information to try to capture from there. So as we've been doing that, we've been working with PSMFC, and we were actually able to secure funding for a data management specialist, someone who would be focused on helping to fill out regulations. We've also thought a little bit about how we might prioritize how we populate the database, and specifically for PSC analyses of Chinook, there are a set of years that might be most relevant and most important to that process. You can see them kind of on screen here, 2007 through 2013, 2019 through 2021. So we might populate those first as a little bit of a trial of the database. And then also, even though we're envisioning potentially expanding this to other species, starting with Chinook at first, since there's the most immediate need for Chinook for management purposes. It might also be possible to just at first focus on mark selective regulations, because there's fewer along the coast, and because then we can use such a database to identify when something was mark selective or not, because if it's in the database, then it was mark selective, and if it's not, then it wasn't. And once again, we eventually plan to kind of populate the whole database, but thinking about kind of strategically about what we might prioritize first is something that's on our minds at the moment. There are a number of challenges that we have faced or are facing with this database, and maybe one of the first ones that we could go through is just thinking about historic regulations. WDFW has recreational regulation information going back to at least 1980. And those pamphlets sure have changed a lot over time. You can see on the right side of the screen here, here's an example, kind of a few examples over the years, just of the cover page. But as we're speaking with other agencies, we're learning that there's kind of a variable length of time for which historic regulations are available. What we have at WDFW might not exactly match what ODF&W has or Alaska has, et cetera. So that's still kind of a piece that we're talking through, and I think the plan at the moment is to just try our best to populate it with what we've got from each agency. Once again, maybe prioritizing some of those pieces from the last slide first. The other thing that we're recognizing is that agencies along the West Coast have preserved these historic regulations in a variety of formats at the moment. So there's everything from just paper copies to electronic scans of regulation pamphlets to, in some cases, there's existing regulation databases. We can talk about those in a moment, but in all cases that I'm aware of, those regulation databases haven't been updated. So they might be good for going back and getting some information from, but not currently active. So once again, we're aiming to eventually get whatever historic regulations there might be in the database, and aiming to see kind of how that goes. I mentioned earlier that we had some challenges with kind of how all of this might fit together. Conceptually, I think we have a roadmap, but I think in the end, we're going to need to be able to run some tests on how we would link the database to coded wire tags. I think there's still some additional pieces to work out there. One of the ones that's perhaps has had the most questions thus far is how we're going to link up location codes. Regulations are typically defined, location codes. Regulations are typically defined kind of by specific management areas. Those management areas don't always match up perfectly with ARMIS location codes. And so to be able to link those two together, we've had a few different ideas. Either we could use kind of an external lookup table that links ARMIS location codes to management areas, or maybe even in the regulation database itself, we could have a separate field for that ARMIS location code. And once again, we're still kind of working out exactly how all that'll work together. Another thing is that we have quite an aggressive timeline on this one. So the Pacific Salmon Treaty stipulates that we would integrate those mark selective algorithms into the Chinook analysis by next year. And by next year, quite early in the year, mid-February, our work group has kind of recognized that there's a really tremendous amount of work ahead. We know that that timeline is really ambitious. We are in the process of hiring a specialist and potentially going to work on getting training for that specialist, getting the database front end together, figuring out how the pieces fit together. I know that it's kind of getting into November now, and that February timeline once again is looking really ambitious. So we're aiming for that, but we're figuring that kind of any progress that we're making now is forward progress to completing that analysis next year, or who knows, maybe all the stars will align and we'll be able to get to it this year. So. One of the other main challenges is that this is not the first attempt at a regulations database. I know of kind of two that have existed historically. Folks might have heard of the RAID database, which was maintained by the Washington co-managers maybe about a decade or so ago. And then there was also one that was done by DFO. The lead on that was Chuck Parkin. Both of those tasks had failed. I've spoken to kind of some of the biologists involved in those projects, and it kind of crumbled under its own weight because it was such a tremendous task to kind of keep on updating it. So in our work group, we decided that hiring a data management specialist was really critical to the success of this project, so that we could have someone to really be focused on it and continue updating it. Of course, to have someone who continues to update this going forward into the future, that also means continuing to pursue funding for the project. And we've received kind of 2 grants currently from PSC, 2 years of funding, and we're hoping to kind of get more going forward into the future. So I want to just, before I finish off here, I just want to say thanks to the many agencies involved in this project. Even though I'm presenting here today, there have been some key individuals who've been really instrumental in getting this off the ground, particularly folks at Alaska Department of Fish and Game, Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife, the tribes, PSMFC, NOAA, and DFO. Want to thank PSC, particularly the MSF Fund, for granting us 2 years of funding. He's not here with me today, but really kind of a lot of the brains behind this operation in initial database design and development was one of my colleagues, Ty Garber at WDFW. And then, of course, also thanks to Nancy Leonard, who's taking a leadership role in helping to continue development and also helping out with hiring a specialist there. So like I said, I'll end off there, and I'm happy to take any questions that folks might have.
Thank you, Derek. Do you have any questions for Derek, or any suggestions on where we can find the historical regulations in your agency?
Yeah. Derek, this is Dan Rotting with Washington Fish and Wildlife. Good to see you. Question is, does the regulation database deal with the planned regulations, or is it the actual regulations that we have that are implemented through emergency regulations? Thank you.
Thanks, Dan. And that's a really great question. That's something that we've discussed a little bit back and forth with the group. And I think that we're intending to have both. So in some of those fields that specify start and end dates, we're planning to have both what was planned as well as kind of what was actually implemented.
Thanks for the answer. I think that's a great way to go.
If I may, this is Laura. I had a question too, and it came up. And I believe you gave a presentation. I'm also on SPEC with PSC, and I believe you gave us a presentation. What came up? Some of the feedback from, and even more so from Fisheries and Oceans Canada, was why is it a standalone database? Why not integrate it from the start with the ARMIS system and have them kind of be compatible or hold the data together?
Do you want me to take a stab at that?
And I actually have a related question, which is, I think what I'm asking will help, not help necessarily. I'm wondering why you're wanting to integrate it with Argus.
We're not integrating that. So one,
Well, like the locations, for example. I
yeah,
don't
we
see any
want, that's
reason.
for the
I don't see any
analysis.
reason for
It's
that.
to facilitate the analysis part.
Yeah.
And the projection on the map. So what we're billing it separately because the Artemis system right now is guided by the Pacific Salmon Commission data specification, and Canada is not willing yet to commit to modifying the specifications, so work those data. So we're seeing it more as a pilot. We're using whoever wants to play, mainly the states and hopefully some Canada. We'll build this on the side, but with the end game of knowing that we'll be able to query both and make it easier for the analysis. But at least by billing over here, we're not entering to discussion about modifying the Canada-US specification at this time. So that's easing into it. Derek, I don't know if you want to add to that.
No, I think that was a good answer, Nancy. And yeah, I guess just to kind of build upon it maybe a little bit, the reason why we need to be able to combine this and Armis is exactly right. It's for the analysis. Right now, our agreed to kind of Chinook analysis that we're using for management evaluation is really dependent on those coded wire tags and looking at the distribution of fishing impacts kind of across the West Coast. So being able to link up kind of our current system of analysis and be able to account for those mark selected fisheries, we need to be able to kind of link those two pieces together.
Yeah, absolutely.
But I do like your suggestion of us having, like we do in StreamNet, side-by-side columns, so we can keep the management, geographic areas that you assign regulation to, and then do a connection to Armis just to support the map. Anything else? There's a hand up. Everyone knows who it is.
Craig, is that you? Hold on, I can check.
You can do view. It's John. It's Brody.
Oh, okay, Brody, go ahead. You can go first.
Brody's first.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Hey, Derek, how does this relate to our own internal WFW regulations database?
So
Thank you.
we have a thanks, Brody. We have Sportal, which is our own internal regulations database, and we're hoping to use Sportal to help in the population of some of the database, the regulations database that we're describing here, because there is valuable information there that we could pull out, especially for freshwater and some of the pieces that we haven't built yet into kind of our template database that we've got going. But the thing is that we kind of passed along the idea of potentially using that Sportal database as the basis for this. We wanted something that was multi-agency, but then also we wanted something that was kind of having kind of the fields that would be able to be integrated across the agencies and also be able to work with kind of the style of PSC analysis. We wanted something that we could kind of pull out in a little bit different way than was currently accessible in Sportal. Brody, you're muted.
If we need to alter that design, that's something that we should talk about internally to add those data elements.
Thanks, Brody. We can talk on the side.
Hey, John, go ahead.
Hey, Derek, good talk or good presentation. I was curious, it sounds like, or at least I've been hearing maybe that the commission's starting to play around a little bit with the idea of incorporating more PBT analysis into some of these mixed stock fisheries. I'm wondering if that's being considered in any of this as a potential going forward genetics analysis.
Thanks, John. I have what is probably a really unsatisfying answer here, because as the 2019 treaty got agreed to, there was kind of a mix of different things that the Pacific Salmon Commission and the overall treaty was calling for. We have been in the process of looking at how we might kind of improve model development going forward in the future. We have a whole work group set up at looking at different ideas, particularly for the next treaty, but starting to get some of those ideas in place now. And as we've been thinking about some of those elements, we have been looking at how we may be able to incorporate kind of some of the GSI data into the work that we do. But the reason why I said that I thought this might be a really unsatisfying answer is because, to the best of my knowledge, a lot of those discussions are still at a relatively early stage.
Any other questions? Danella?
Hi, I just wanted to piggyback on that last question. How would you, so if they're still at an early stage, how would you foresee the best way to advance them from just early discussions to implementation, and even maybe even opportunities for research on, because I know currently, right, you use coded wire tagging for a lot of that, but incorporating like PBT genetic analysis into that monitoring?
That's that's a really interesting question there, and I have to say, Danella, my answer on this one is going to be kind of from my perspective. I don't know the very best way that we might be able to expedite that process, but to me, I think that that there's utility that we could potentially get from GSI data that we're currently lacking from CWT data. So being able to show that that utility exists would be a good thing. So, for example, I'm thinking about things like sublegal stock compositions. In Chinook, when there's a size limit and we get fish that are, we get CWT recoveries from fish that are of a certain size. We get larger sized fish, but we still need to account for those sublegal impacts in the analyses that we do. And since we don't get coded wire tags returned from those sublegal sized fish, what's the alternative? How do we know what we're catching in terms of stocks of those smaller fish? And so we do have kind of, at least speaking from Washington's perspective, we have a number of genetic samples that we've taken over the past few decades in our sampling programs from those sublegal sized fish, but they haven't been analyzed. So one of the things, one of the reasons why we're not quite there yet to use that information in Chinook management and why those samples haven't been analyzed is because I know that we're in the process of updating our genetic baselines all along Puget Sound. I know that, particularly speaking to some of our genetics lab folks, that we're looking at kind of trying to update some of that baseline information for Skagit and Stillaguamish, Snohomish, Nooksack Springs. We're hoping that we can kind of use those first to identify between each other, and then be able to maybe get better baseline information for some of the other stocks as well to be able to differentiate. Currently, when we kind of get genetic information coming back from Puget Sound Chinook, it can identify, for example, that it is a Central or South Sound fish, but it can't necessarily say whether that fish belonged to Green River or whether it belonged to Nisqually or Minter Creek or what have you. So being able to kind of differentiate those to a greater levels is would help to kind of increase the utility of that tool, because when we do management on each of those stocks, we don't manage to just South Sound or Central Sound as a whole. We manage to Green River or Nisqually or these other pieces. So that kind of highlights maybe, I know that was a very long-winded answer, but that kind of highlights to me where some of the potential future utility of the GSI is versus kind of what we have in the CWTs now that can't be captured in the GSI.
Are you considering at some point maybe submitting a proposal to PSC to do an exploratory add-on component with your GSI data?
I will say I'm not aware of anything right now, because I think that the main priority right now is not getting the samples analyzed. I think it's more trying to update some of the fishery samples analyzed. I think right now it's more trying to get updated baseline information, so that when we do go to identify kind of what stocks those samples are from, we might have greater resolution. It's likely a few-year process at the least.
Any other questions? As you move on. Right. Thanks a lot, Derek. We appreciate taking the time to join us today and sharing this with this group. Because I know there's a lot of interest in it, I'm sure. And they will be definitely a resource for us to try and find these regulations. And Tammy, who you might not see, that's all the way at the end there, is the Columbia Basin Fish and Wildlife Librarian. So she'll be helping us see if we can locate some of these documents too.
That all sounds great, and thank you all for the opportunity to present. I'm going to put my email in the chat here just in case anybody has any follow-up questions or would like more information.
Awesome.
Thank you.
Thanks, Derek.